We regret that there was a technical problem recording 3 of our classes, Class 12, Class 13, and Class 21. The signal is not as clear on these 3 classes as it is in all the other recordings, but you can still hear what Dr. Bonnette is saying. Apologies for the inconvenience. This is Class 12.
Okay, we're on page 12, and just about to look at the definition of law. Does anybody have any questions about anything we've covered up to this point?
I have a question.
Sure.
That's maybe doesn't have anything to do with what we've covered, but I came across the terms organic and inorganic philosophy. Do you know the distinction?
You will find terms like that are used all over the place by different people in different ways. And the only way you can tell is by looking at how somebody is using it. I can think of about a dozen different ways you might use it, so I wouldn't know how to answer that. I mean, usually, I mean, if you're talking natural science, inorganic, of course, means not pertaining to matters of life. Organic pertains to things having organs, and things have organs because they are like cells. They have different parts doing different things for the good of the whole. And so the term organic usually refers to something where you have multiple organs acting for the good of the whole, and it gets identified with living things. But organic chemistry deals with the building blocks of life, but many of the things that you're dealing with in organic chemistry are not alive. They're the sorts of things that when you put them together are found in living things, so we call it organic chemistry. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a difficult question to answer.
I just wanted to make sure whether they weren't recognized streams within the larger school of thought. It's more of a subjective usage thing.
That's right. Anything else? All right, let's take a look at what we have on page 12 here, which refers to page 68 in Higgins. It defines, or page 60, I guess it's under 68, defines law according to 4 points, which I think we take up in another page or two, but just a very quick look at it. An ordinance of reason for the common good promulgated by him who has care of the community. There's 4 parts of this. It's an ordinance of reason. An ordinance, of course, is a rule. It has to be measured according to reason. And that, of course, gives us a hint that if you've got a completely irrational law, you don't have a law. It has to be for the common good. Common good of what? Some kind of a societal unit, whether it be the family or a village, or it could even be a corporation or a county or a state or a nation as a whole. Promulgated, that's an important one because sometimes people say, I didn't know about the law. How can you apply this to me? Well, usually ignorance is not bliss in that case, but that presumes that the law has been promulgated. And of course, it's like the IRS promulgates its 5,000 rules. They're somewhere in some book, but nobody knows them all and nobody can find them all. But they do know they have to be promulgated, so they publish them. It's probably more than 5,000, isn't it? Probably more like 25,000. But if you don't let a law be known, it's not fair. As you can well imagine, it just isn't kosher to bind somebody according to something they just don't know anything about. And tell them, you broke the law. What law? I didn't know there was a law. By him who has care of a community. Now that implies some kind of governance. And that implies that if you have a community, in some way there must be a unified source for these laws. So everybody in a society, human society, is not a law unto himself, but he's bound by the laws that have been promulgated and instituted by whoever has care of the community. Now, of course, in a representative government, we elect representatives, and they in turn represent the people, in order to enact laws, or, of course, in some instances, you may have a king, you may have a dictator. But somebody has to lay down these laws that are to be followed. And of course, the natural question is, how does that apply to what we call natural law? Because when you talk about natural law, you're not thinking about human society, but you're thinking about the relationship between human nature and God. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail in about a page here. Page 69 in Higgins refers to the specific moral determinants. But what these are is what we call the three criteria by which we adjudge the morality of an act. There are, first of all, what's called the object, or the substance of the act, or the end of the act, which is basically what is the nature of this act. What is the act in itself? Is it an act of murder, theft, charity, gratitude, stealing, adultery? All these interesting things. So if we say Jones robbed a bank, that specifies the essence, the object, the nature of what he did. Now, the end, or the end of the agent, or the motive, is something quite different. That's the reason why the agent performs the act. Now, Jones may have robbed the bank for a very laudable purpose, just as presumably Robin Hood was robbing people for an allegedly laudable purpose. Perhaps Jones robs the bank because he intends to give the money to the poor, which is certainly wonderful. Of course, there is a slight difficulty with respect to how he got the money. And then finally, we have the circumstances or the situation, the accidents, when, where, why, and how, when, where, and how in which the act is performed. So robbing a bank would, by, for example, just submitting a little note to the teller saying, hand me your money, would not be as bad as doing it with a machine gun. And you doing it with a machine gun would not be as bad as using the machine gun. So the circumstances can alter the morality of an act. The important thing to realize, though, is that for an act to be good, all three of these determinants must be good. You can't say, what I was doing was good and it was for a good purpose, it's just the circumstances were wrong. That doesn't work. You can't say the circumstances were right and my motive was right, but what I did was wrong. That doesn't work either. And even if the circumstances are right and you do a good thing for the wrong reason, that's wrong too. So the nasty little requirement of natural law is that when we perform a good act, it has to be completely good. It has to be good in every respect, and of course, we'll take a look at that again in a closer way a little bit later on. Now, respect to the moral object, which is the first of these three, the substance of the act, the end of the act. And be careful, when you talk about the end of the act, that's a little bit confusing, at least it is to me, because it sounds like, well, the end of the act is the reason I'm doing it. No, it's the intrinsic finality of the act itself. If it's an act of theft, the end of the act is thievery. My purpose in doing it is irrelevant to the nature of the act itself. So there is a distinction between the end of the act and the end of the agent. But the moral object, that is what the act is distinguished between good and evil, and whether it is by nature or by law. An act may be morally good by nature. In other words, the very nature of it is good. For example, love of God. How can you go wrong? That's very nature. It's a good act. It may be good by law. The example here would be to pay taxes by April 15th. It's good to do it by April 15th because that's what the law says. If you wait until April 16th, it isn't that you violated the very nature of something, but you violated the positive law that said you had to do it by April 15th. And also an act can be indifferent, like driving a car. There's nothing good or bad about it unless you happen to be the getaway car at the robbery. Then driving a car becomes wrong because of the reason for which you are driving it. Laws may, or moral objects may be evil by their very nature. For example, telling a lie. People get awfully confused on that one, and we'll have fun with that later on when we're dealing with the nature of lying. It's a very interesting topic. But by its very nature, a lie, if it is a true lie, is immoral. Just as murder, if it is genuinely murder, is immoral by its very nature. Theft, by its very nature, is immoral if it is theft. Of course, we have to very carefully define what we mean by these terms when we apply them. Something may be evil by law, using the same example of not paying your taxes by April 15th. If you don't do it by April 15th, and you didn't get an extension, then that's wrong by law. We have precepts that are based upon natural law. For example, that we must respect other people. Now that's a general precept, always true. And it stands as a measure for civil law. Now, part of respecting others arises when you talk about driving a car. How do you respect others while driving a car? Well, the difficulty, of course, is you can't just drive anywhere where you want. That's what's called a parking lot, which is inherently one of the most dangerous places to drive, as we all know. Civil law, therefore, specifies and particularizes the natural law and says that you have to drive to the right. That would be in the United States or Canada. If you are driving in Great Britain, you have to drive to the left. You're still respecting other people. If we all drive wherever we want, we sometimes run into head-on situations, in which case we're not respecting the other driver. Now, a positive law, civil law is sometimes called positive law. Remember, the term positive law means it comes from the will. It comes from somebody's will. Now, that does not mean it's arbitrary. Presumably, when a legislature says we will all drive on the right side of the road, that is an eminently reasonable agreement. We agree, we pass this law, that's what it will be. In another country, you could pass it on the left. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong, but you have to have a convention or you have head-on accidents. And once we have established that that's what the law is, then, although it's a positive law, if you violate it, of course, you are morally responsible for having violated the law. And because implicitly, you have not respected other people by failing to follow the convention that has been ordained by common consensus or through the will of a governor or through the will of a legislature representing the people. Now this raises an interesting point, and that is, if a civil law violates natural law, St. Thomas tells us, and it makes eminent sense, then it's not a law. It's not a law at all. A civil law cannot violate natural law. And of course, that's exactly what you have if you have Congress or the courts violating natural law by saying, for example, that it's okay to kill unborn children. There's nothing in heaven or earth that can make that okay, make that licit, can make that a binding law that can bind on people the obligation either to do it or to participate in it or even to pay taxes to support it. Any law of that sort is a violation of natural rights. But that, of course, isn't the only example. Another one is, for example, Dred Scott, which was a United States Supreme Court decision which declared that Negroes were not human beings and could be treated as slaves. this, of course, is an absolute violation of natural law. Or, as our founding fathers insisted, excessive taxation without representation. I don't even know if you have to add the without representation part. Excessive taxation, by the very fact it's excessive, is unreasonable, and if it's unreasonable, it's against natural law. Natural law has to be reasonable. Has to be reasonable. So that there are a number of ways in which it is possible to pass a law which is not really a binding law. Now, of course, you get into very interesting ethical and societal questions as, well, what do you do when your society has passed such a law? A law, for example, insisting that there can be marriage between people of the same sex is contrary to right reason. It is a non-existent law in objective terms. But in the states and countries where it has been enacted, it is treated as positive law. So you get into some terrible binds for individual people as to how do you deal with a law which you know to be objectively immoral, and yet which has been enacted by your governmental unit, and which binds you possibly with penalties or fine or imprisonment if you don't obey it. And of course, this is part of the human existential situation, which is not always comfortable. And this is where you get into all kinds of very particular situations and trying to determine what is right and what is reasonable. And oftentimes, individuals can't figure it out by themselves, which is why they will seek the advice of experts, or they may ask the judgment of the church to give them some guidance as to what is the ethical thing to do in this kind of a cross-purpose situation. It's not always easy, and sometimes there isn't an easy way out. Well, look at what just happened in the United States military, where the chaplains were ordered to marry same-sex couples. And all of the Catholic chaplains, and I dare say most all of the Protestant chaplains, just said, we won't do it. Period. God bless them all. And I believe at that point the military backed down, or whoever it was gave the order. But this sometimes can happen, as we all unfortunately know. And of course, as far as positive laws are concerned, you can have circumstances in which they may seem to be irrational to the point that they need not be observed. For example, a stop sign in the middle of the desert. Now, I'm not going to tell you to run a stop sign, but it is manifestly evident there's no rational basis for placing the stop sign there. It is a general law that they can put stop signs places where you should stop, but it's manifestly evident in some cases it just doesn't make any sense. And you would not be committing a moral infraction if you ran the stop sign, assuming you can see every direction for 6 miles. But then what happens if there was a state trooper hiding in a gully with a radar or something and just observed you go through the stop sign? Now what happens? Can you plead the case? I'm not bound by this. I don't think you can get away with that. It is a positive law. If you violate it, you have to face the penalty and accept the penalty for having done so. That's a different matter because that pertains to the common good of society, that we ought not be able to willy-nilly break every law we wish. So this gets complicated. Remember, what we're doing here, this is an introduction to ethics, so please don't look at me and ask me to explain a complete answer to every possible problem or situation you can dream up, because I can't do it. Some things it takes time. You have to reflect on them to figure out what it is to do. Fortunately, most things are not of this nature. Most things are fairly cut and dried, fairly obvious. Don't hit the person next to you with a blackjack. Don't reach in their pocket and steal their money. I mean, we know these things pretty much. So The very difficult circumstance that people sometimes get into, this particularly arises in bioethical context, you can and should consult an appropriate expert or authority who you have reason to trust for guidance where you simply can't figure it out yourself. And we will later on, of course, examine those contexts in which you don't have the availability of expert guidance as to what is it you're supposed to do in those cases. But that's down the road a bit. Shall we go on to natural law? Now, by natural law, we're talking about the law of nature, which is basically, remember, what God has created is nature. When God creates, he gives things a certain way of being, a certain set of limitations or operative potencies that condition its way of existing and what it can do and what it cannot do. That's its nature. If you want to get really technical, I think Aristotle says nature is the first principle of motion and rest in that in which it is. Aren't you glad you asked?
Say that again, please.
Nature is the first principle of motion and rest in that in which it is. Does that help? It's right in the first couple paragraphs of Book 1 of Aristotle's Physics. Remember, physics is simply an anglicization of the Greek word for nature. So when you talk about physical nature, you're being redundant. And what you just said is natural nature. But what we normally mean by physical would be those things that are material. And so the natural law for material things is what we study in physics and chemistry and in a somewhat restricted way, biology and astronomy and so forth. These are the laws that govern the behavior of physical entities. And of course, you're dealing with the empirical sciences there, the empirical sciences and also the experimental sciences. The empirical is not the same thing as experimental. Sometimes we think of it as if it were the same. Empirical means that which is experienced through the senses, whereas experimental refers to a certain method of testing various hypotheses that are proposed for various parts of physical reality. So, the experimental method has largely dominated natural science for the last half millennium. Not that it didn't exist before, but people forget that, say, Aristotle was engaged in empirical science when he wrote his physics. When he, for example, described the various species of fish that were available in the Mediterranean. And everybody thinks, well, that's Aristotle. What did he know about science? Well, in 1900, the scientists were laughing at Aristotle because he said there were something like 53 species of fish in the Mediterranean. And as far as the scientists at the time knew, there weren't anywhere near that number. But it was Aristotle who had the last laugh because it turns out they discovered them all in the next 50 or 100 years. In fact, it would have been probably 50 years because I'm citing information that I got about 1960. What Aristotle did is he would go down to the seashore and he paid the fishermen to give him examples of the fish. So he was an empirical scientist, and a pretty good one. People don't realize that. Anyway, physical natural law. Anybody want to go break it? Good luck. Go break the law of gravity. Go jump off the escarpment. We don't break the physical natural law. If anything, we break ourselves upon it. Don't have a choice about that one. That's something to kind of bear in mind before we look at natural law pertaining to ourselves, because the same principle is true. We can't break the rules of our nature. We can only break ourselves upon it. But fundamentally, that's why natural law, natural moral law, is binding. It's binding because it is a description of the way we are, what we are, who we are, and how we ought to be and how we ought to act to fulfill our nature. A bird or an atom cannot fail to act according to its nature. We, by that wonderful gift of free will, have been given the blessed capability of screwing it all up. And indeed we do. I always think of that famous British dictum where they say, oh, what a lovely mess we have. And we do sometimes manage to make them of ourselves. All right, the moral law, which pertains to free beings. And of course, that would apply to the angelic order as well as the human order. First of all is the eternal law. Now, this is from the standpoint of God. God, from all eternity, knows everything that he creates and knows how it is to be. Because after all, when he says for it to be, that's how it is. The eternal law, now, as far as man is concerned, in his nature and as known by his reason, is called the natural law. But from God's perspective, it's eternal law. From our perspective, we call it natural law. And since, from God's perspective, it is universal, it pertains to every human being, and insofar as human nature has certain fixed, permanent boundaries, it is unchanging. So natural law is not something that is only for this person or this group of people and not others, and it is not true at one time and false at another time. It does not evolve with time. The principles that underlie it are permanent and universal. Now that doesn't mean that as contexts change, the application of the law does not change. For example, it was undoubtedly morally reprehensible and horrifying in 1910 if a woman showed her ankle. Clearly, that would not be the case today. The general principles of modesty still pertain, but the context has so shifted that it no longer has that particular application. An ectopic pregnancy, until about 1940, was considered something that you could not morally end by any means. But about 1940, theologians and philosophers came to the realization that it was a pathological condition, applied the principle of double effect to it, and then concluded you could excise that portion of the tube with perfect laicity. That does not mean the moral principles changed, but it did mean that our understanding of the application of the principles did change, and that can happen. The place where you'll get the most changes in the application of ethical laws today would probably be what we call bioethics. Because as advances in medicine take place, as new things are discovered, we have to constantly reflect and ask ourselves, how do these constant and unchanging principles apply to this new context, this new medication, which we at one time understood to work a certain way, and later on we understood, well, for example, the famous pill a contraceptive pill, it simply wasn't realized initially that it had the effect of preventing implantation and therefore was abortifacient. So its characterization as contraceptive becomes replaced morally with a characterization as abortifacient. And that makes a huge difference as to the morality of its use and the gravity of the morality of its use. And that's something we didn't know initially. We didn't understand the biochemistry of how it worked. Susan?
I don't think there's a difference, but that's okay. I think it's off topic, really.
Difference between what? Between contraception and abortion?
Yes.
There is an objective difference because contraception prevents the beginning of life. Abortion ends it. The contraceptive mentality may be intrinsically abortifacient, but it's not, it isn't understood that way by many people, and the nature of the act is not. I mean, clearly there are acts that one could engage in that are not going to kill a human being, even though they are contraceptive in nature. And you have to look at various.
I understand that, but I'm considering the end, I guess.
When you consider the end, you're talking about the intentionality. That's not the nature of the act.
Okay.
And that's why you've got to have these three different determinants. It doesn't mean that something, you may have two acts that are both immoral. They may be specifically different. They may have different levels of immorality. They may have the same intentionality on the part of the agent. See, that's why it gets very complex. And it's not a matter of saying one's right and the other's wrong. It's a matter of recognizing they're different. Just as we recognize that some acts may be more immoral than other acts. You may have two acts that are immoral and one can be worse than another. Aggravated by circumstances or even aggravated by the nature of how it's done or what is done even. So ethics is horribly complex. Anybody tells you it's really simple. The general principles are what we're trying to understand.
Right.
And particular cases can drive you up a wall. All right, so the eternal law, the natural law, is universal and unchanging. The civil law can be varied, because that's why the example given that some places you drive on the left side of the road, other places you drive on the right. I'm not quite sure. The next line says, form causes the operation towards the end. I can't doubt it, but I don't know what it's got. Oh, I see, okay. If you turn over to page 13, it's a heading for the next point here. The form, in other words, the substantial form, the nature of a thing determines its operation towards an end. This is very evident. You know, sometimes people say, well, in nature, we don't talk about teleology anymore. Scientists since the time of Darwin don't want to talk about teleology. There's no goal-oriented activity. But they drive themselves up a wall because they find, especially in talking about Darwinian evolution, they keep finding themselves talking about things as if there were goals. Very hard not to. Very difficult not to. But even if you look at the inorganic level of minerals, the agent operates towards an end. If it didn't operate toward an end, we couldn't have science. Chemistry. You look at a chemistry book. What's the first thing it tells you about some substance, say sodium? It'll tell you it's a soft, whitish metal. And of course, it immediately and invariably tells you don't drop it in water, because you'll get one heck of a reaction. Now, what that's doing is telling you something about its nature by what it will do in the face of certain circumstances. And it will always act that way. And if you couldn't classify chemicals according to how they behave in certain circumstances, you couldn't have the science of chemistry. So anybody who says there's no finality, there's no goal orientation, I think what they're trying to say is that the sodium isn't sitting there and saying, boy, am I going to make this water explode when I react with it. Well, okay, I'm sure the sodium isn't thinking that because it's not thinking at all. But if by goal-oriented activity you mean that in a certain set of circumstances or reacting with a certain reagent, it will react the same way every time, that is simply necessary for the classifications we need for science. We couldn't have science if we didn't know that. And what it means is that the behavior of this substance is predictable. Given certain standard conditions, it will always tend to react the same way. And when you say tend to react, that means tending towards a certain outcome, tending towards a certain result, tending towards a certain end or goal. Forgive me, but that's finality. That's what is meant by finality. We're not saying that the inorganic agent knows the end of its activity, but it does have an end, and we need to have it have an end, or you couldn't specify it and classify it, and you couldn't have science. And that's true of all the things we study in natural science. Classification presupposes consistency of action in certain cases, circumstances. Otherwise, you could not distinguish sodium from molybdenum or from strontium. They'd all be the same because you couldn't predict what they're going to do. Plants have ends, again, fixed by nature. They behave a certain definite way. Brute animals, I realize people today, they don't want to call them brutes. Very, very, very discriminatory terminology to call them just a brute. You'd be amazed how careful you have to be when you write and publish things today, because there's people just waiting to be offended. Brutes, again, seek ends, certain ends that are fixed by their nature. But when you get to man, that's where it gets interesting. Man has certain ends that are unfree with respect to our nature. They are fixed according to our nature. We are by nature ordered towards achieving our own survival by nutrition. We are ordered by our nature through reproduction to maintain the species. Absolutely essential. Notice you don't have to worry about the animal kingdom voluntarily ceasing to reproduce itself so that it goes to extinction. But man's different. We are free. Being free, we can act against our nature. According to nature, species reproduce, keep themselves going, all other things being equal. We, through the modern means of contraception and abortion, are actually able to decrease our reproductive activity to the point that we can extinguish ourselves. I don't know how many countries today, I know John Stossel did a program where I'm amazed it got published a number of years ago. You may have seen it, where he looked at all the countries in the world. This is when everybody was saying, oh, we're going to 13 billion, we're going to be populated off the world. He said this is utter nonsense. If you look at every country on earth, there's only about 5 of them that are meeting their reproductive needs to just stay even. And what he did is he calculated, you've got to have 2.2 children to replace yourself. I don't know how you get that 0.2 kid, but it must be a very difficult one to raise. But in virtually every country on earth, they're below 2.2, including the United States. And what Stossel did was to look at all the different countries, calculate the rate at which the population was declining, and it really has been massively declining. Russia has gone from a country of 200 million people to 160 million in the last, 40 years. That's scary. It should be. But anyway, Stossel calculated at the rate that the population was declining, they would put on the screen, this was ABC News, they would put on the screen the year at which France would cease to exist. And it was like 2200. The year at which Italy would cease to exist. The year at which Germany would cease to exist, at the rate the population was going down. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about some of these things later in the course. I'm getting ahead of myself here. But the interesting thing, there was only like 5 countries on Earth where the population reproductive rate exceeded replacement. And they were, I believe, in West Africa. That was it. All the rest of them were going down. So by the use of our free will, man can do what no other species would do. We can annihilate ourselves. We can create a system, well, I mean, good Lord, look at what we've done with Social Security. It is a Ponzi scheme. And it's one where it was initiated before you have widespread contraception and abortion, so that now we don't have the young suckers coming along to join the requirements to keep the system going. Small wonder there just aren't enough people to take care of the elderly under the Social Security system. It's impossible, and yet you see, you don't really hear about anybody blaming our reproductive malfeasance for the problem that we're in, when it is the most obvious cause. It's not that they misconceived it completely at the beginning. At the beginning, it was not completely impossible. But of course, at the beginning, it was never intended to be anything but a supplement to our income. Now we have many, many people living on it. Things don't stay the same that way. But because man is free, we can, as it says here, revolt against our own nature. We can revolt against our nature, which orders us to a certain amount of reproduction, and which makes it a very serious moral matter that we do reproduce ourselves, because the very continued existence of our society depends on it. It's not a matter, as we've been given to think, of pure pleasure. Just anybody's pleasure. That's all. You want to have kids for the pleasure of having kids, go ahead, have them. If you don't want to have them, don't bother with it. No. This is a serious matter which falls on society as a whole. Not every individual is obligated to get married, but society as a whole must meet the means and needs of reproducing itself. So, natural law is universal, which means it pertains to all men because we share the same specific nature. Man is a rational animal. And our nature is fairly specific. And I'm thinking to myself, could we run into 3-headed Martians who would have a completely different nature with respect to, say, reproduction? I suppose, I don't know. I'm not going to get into argument about that, but the point is, yeah, I suppose if you had a reproductive system that required 3 people instead of 2, I guess the rules would be a little different, wouldn't it? But the point is, that's not our nature. As Genesis says, God made us male and female, and until you find a species that doesn't operate this way, the rules pertaining to reproduction are binding and universal because they pertain to our nature as the kind of rational animal that we are. Unchanging simply because our nature is unchanging. The same last end measures the good of all acts. In other words, all of us by our nature is oriented to seeking the good and ultimately the ultimate good, which is God himself. You don't don't see that, just looking at a human being from a purely biological standpoint, you don't see that. You have to analyze the nature of man, analyze the nature of will and intellect, and understand that we are not satisfied. We are built in with this thirst to apprehend truth, to know the good, to seek the good, and we're never satisfied with less than the infinite good, which we can't have in this life. That's some of the things that we were talking about earlier in the course. But because we share the same intellective, volitional, sentient nature as human beings, we share that same last end, that last goal, which measures every act we perform in terms of the nature concretely that we are exercising as we live. And we share that same common nature. So, indeed, you can have new circumstances, and you then have to apply the pre-existing eternal and natural law to them. I already talked about that a little bit as to how circumstances can make for a slightly different application of the law. But there's a mouthful in this next point here, B. The express essential relationships of unchanging human nature determine unchanging natural law. What on earth does that mean? The express essential relationships. In other words, we have relationship within ourselves between our various powers and our last end, and we also have an essential relationship to other human beings in society and in terms of the common ends of society. All of this structure is not purely a matter of whim and will. It is concretely based upon the stable nature which human beings have. We vary, we have a lot of accidental differences, but those do not determine the content of our ethics. Our ethics is determined by that which we have in common. And that's why the recognition of the dignity of every human being means it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with somebody who's well or ill, young or old, microscopic within its mother's womb, or comatose at the other end of life waiting to enter to its eternal reward. It doesn't make any difference because you're always dealing with human beings, and the express relationship which we have to every human being is that of respecting and loving and seeking the good of every other human being to the extent that it is rationally possible. That's what I mean by essential relationships, an unchanging human nature, determining an unchanging natural law. This is not to denigrate the complexity of society and the complexity of ourselves, but it is to recognize that there are certain common, constant principles and powers that have to interact in a stable way, and that reason and will should constantly be seeking to maximize the good. Remember, it's do good, avoid evil, seek good. The metaphysical foundation of our very existence is that we are ordered to maximize being, our own being and the being of others and the being of society. We are ordered towards building up, towards seeking the good as we understand it, and not tearing down and destroying, breaking down, killing, negating. That's the whole existential thrust of ourselves as human beings is towards the positive and away from the negative to the extent that it is possible. And we do this in terms of the structure of our existence as it is given to us. We do not invent ourselves. We do not create man. We do not create ourselves. We have a received existence. And that's why those who do away with God would have us become gods and would have us create the terms of our own existence. And you see that in many people today. They want to make up their own laws. They are God. They make up whatever rules they want. They can do whatever whatever they want to do, whatever gives them pleasure or power or their own personal purpose. But that isn't our option, because we are not the creator, we are creatures. It's very humbling to be told that and to have to live that fact. But we can only be as we are. For us to seek to be what we are not is to seek to be nothing. To step outside our nature is to step towards non-being. So for us to seek to be God is self-destructive. For us to create our own nature and create our own moral law is to destroy ourselves, because that isn't our position. We maximize our being by recognizing our creatureliness. And we maximize our being by allowing God to use us as instruments of His purpose in creating us. So, for that reason, natural law should be freely imposed by man upon himself. We should freely impose this law on ourselves. It's the wisest thing to do. I've got a little chart here. One of Dr. Waters' specialties. I'm not really sure I can do it justice, but I think what he's describing here, you have it in front of you, this little chart with God creating man. God creates. He is the efficient cause of our being. He is the exemplary cause. That is, he is the ultimate example, the good, which we are to try to emulate in our being and which we participate in to the extent that our nature allows us to do it. We participate in the goodness of God by living to the fullness of the nature that He has given us. We don't have any other way to go. People want to get real creative here. All you do is create towards non-being. All you do is commit existential suicide. And of course, we are aiming towards the final cause, which is God as the end of everything that we do. That doesn't mean that at every moment and every good that we seek, we explicitly see it as seeking to act towards God. But if we are acting ethically in general, then our life is ordered towards our last end, which is to get us prepared to reach God as that last end. And the things that are acceptable within that context are morally good, and if they don't interfere with moving us towards that last end. We have this little chart here showing the distinction between the hot coffee and the hot spoon. Of course, the spoon gets hot when you put it in the hot coffee, and God, in a very real sense, by participating in the goodness which God is, we bring that goodness to society. It's got the word sociality here, but in a very real sense, society, again, is not something that we completely invent. Society has certain basic rules that flow from human nature, and therefore, just as we perfect ourselves and make ourselves, in a sense, godlike, by living according to our individual nature, so too we make society on earth become, as Augustine calls it, the kingdom of God on earth, by living out the rules that have been put into our nature in terms of our relationship to each other in a societal union. So that there is, again, this participation of society in the goodness and perfection of God, to the extent that we let good reason control and govern our behavior, reading always human nature adequately considered in everything that we do. But let's just finish up one or 2 points here, and then we'll have to abandon. The eternal law, again, is the law in the mind of God, commanding the natural order of the cosmos to be undisturbed. We sometimes forget. When God creates, that's a command. It's a command that says, be this way. And we don't have the choice. We have the choice to not do it, but we don't have the choice to not do it without consequences. Because we must be as we are as human beings under the penalty of falling away towards nothingness. Not being at all. That's the only alternative we have. You can't become an angel just by putting wings on you any more than you become a bird by putting wings on. You put wings on yourself and try flying off a cliff. It doesn't work too well. We are what we are. So we can't say, gee, I wish God had made me an angel. I might wish it, but that's not what I am. Sometimes we get tempted, some people get tempted to say, well, why can't I be God? Well, that simply isn't the way it is. I am not God, and if I try to be God, I only destroy myself. And many people have done this in the course of history. And for this reason, what we call sin is not simply against the will of God, but it's against the plan of God. God has planned the order of creation. This is not, in other words, we've got to get out of our heads the idea that this is all positive law, that it's all just whim and will, and that God is just putting out rules, don't commit adultery because I don't think you should do it today, but tomorrow it'll be all right. See, can't do that because he has created us so that the commission of adultery violates the relationship between man and woman in marriage, which is a natural institution. It's not an artificial thing. And we can't just make up the rules and break the rules, nor can God, as long as he's creating us with the nature that he's given us. Otherwise, he'd contradict himself and he wouldn't be God. He'd be a contradiction in terms. So you can't just say, to God, please, just ignore this little sin. It's okay, God, you're the boss. You can change it. No, he can't change it because our very nature is being created by him in a certain way of being, and he can't say that what is not, or what is not is. You can't say that cruelty is going to be a good thing. That's why this purely voluntaristic way of looking at ethics doesn't really work. Our nature is part of God's plan. It is the creation. It's always interesting to me how all these terms come together. They come together because you're thinking of something as being just in the volitional order, and it turns out it isn't, because it's also a matter of the intellect perceiving the nature of things as to how they are, which is how they've got to be. We can't cease to be human just because we're tired of being human, any more than we can cease to be existing. We already exist. You ever think about that? From the moment that we exist, every human being is cast into the greatest adventure, like it or not, that is possible, because there are only two possible outcomes. We haven't got a choice but to succeed, because the alternative is unthinkable. And from the moment you exist, you are committed to that challenge. That's why it is so foolish for people to not seek the truth to the best of their ability, because all you're doing is just risking your eternal purpose. You can't, once we exist, you can't say, well, I want to get off this horse. I'm not going to ride it anymore. If you were born a dog, you'd be in better shape that way, because when a dog dies, that's the end of the story, and whether he lived well or badly isn't going to matter. But as a human being, once we exist, we are committed to this existential game, folly, direction, whatever you want to call it. We're in it for keeps, and it's deadly serious. And that's why it is so amazing to me that many people will go through their whole life and not reflect on what the purpose of their life is. That's why Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. And this is why it says sin is against the plan of God, not merely the will of God, or else God could make it licit to hate him. How can God do that? It would be self-contradictory. Okay, we're going to terminate it tonight.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you take the Bible and the preternatural powers that supposedly Adam and Eve had, and then the fall, and then God says you're going to die, you're going to work and all that, did God change our human nature in doing that?
No. You're into theology here, but original sin constitutes a wound of nature, but not the contradiction of nature. As Ludwig puts it, man always had what we have. When you're talking about natural immortality, what he was saying is that we had the ability not die. Not that we could not die, but that it was possible under those circumstances that we would not die if we acted properly. But man's nature, because we are a composite of matter and form, we are subject to corruption, and death is by its nature always present. So that the fact, the gift of immortality was a preternatural gift, which as a gift could be forfeited by sin and withdrawn. But it wasn't the nature of man not to die, it was just we had the possibility that we would not die if we cooperated, which we didn't because we had a taste of the wrong kind of fruit. Okay, thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.